Okay, so we are going to be moving into Chapter 2 today, and we will be in Chapter 2 until we reach our first test date. Chapter 2 is pretty massive. It has lots of kind of parts to it. In other textbooks, this material is covered over 3 or 4 chapters, and they bunch it all together into one chapter. So we're going to have several lectures that cover this one chapter. It's all on the chemistry of life. And it starts off with just talking about basic chemistry and chemistry for biologists. We're going to learn today a lot about the periodic table. We'll learn about atoms. We'll learn about how atoms come together and form larger molecules, larger compounds. And then we'll eventually learn about some biomolecules, which when you have several compounds put together, you can make a larger biomolecule, and we'll learn about the major kinds of biomolecules that are out there. So that's really where we're headed over the next few lectures. So first thing you might wonder is, why talk about chemistry? Why do you thought you were taking a biology course, why do we start off a biology course talking about chemistry? Biological organisms are subject to basic laws of physics and chemistry. And if you took a physics class, you'd spend a lot of time talking about math. If you took a chemistry class, you'd use a little bit of physics as well. Every time you take a science class, you have to know a little bit about some other kind of science to understand it. So we're going to start off talking about chemistry because chemical reactions inside of biological organisms will govern or will control many essential processes that go on inside. So we're going to be talking a lot about photosynthesis in things like land plants, and there's a lot of chemistry going on inside of a chloroplast. And we're going to talk about cellular respiration. So what happens when you eat a hamburger? How do you get the energy out of that hamburger? It's a series of chemical reactions that go on inside of your cells. So we are big sacks of chemicals, and we have chemical reactions going on inside of us all the time, and that controls lots of things that go on inside of an organism. So understanding organisms from a cellular level requires a little bit of chemistry. So biology is multidisciplinary science. Now, not to scare you off too much, I'm not a chemist. I'm not going to be talking in detail about p orbitals and s orbitals and d orbitals and things like that. So if you've taken really good chemistry classes and you have a good solid knowledge in chemistry, you know more than enough for biology. We're going to be talking about chemistry from a biologist's perspective. We're going to learn just enough so that we can understand some of the key factors of chemical objects of chemistry to understand biology. So we're actually going to be drawing some atoms in a way that a chemist would probably cringe. They'd say, oh, that's not really accurate. But we're going to draw it in a way that helps us as biologists understand how these atoms interact. So don't take what I say to a chemistry professor and say, I learned this in biology, and say what you're teaching is wrong, because what I'm teaching is probably a little bit wrong. It's close enough, though, for us to get a good understanding of it. Okay, so most of the chapters that we get into, we have to start off with a little bit of definition work, because that's, I'm going to be using a lot of terms throughout the entire chapter. And it helps for you to know what they mean. So atoms make up all matter. We're going to talk about what an atom is in a second, but what is matter? Matter is anything that takes up space. So there is our non-organic matter, like a rock. Rocks are matter. And then there is organic matter, like the rock, right? So if you take up space, you are matter. And if you are made of matter, then you are made up of atoms at the basic level. And what are atoms? Well, matter is made up by combining one or more elements, and an element is a substance that cannot be broken down by chemical means into another substance. Here is a periodic table of the elements. This is something I will give you on your first test. It is something that you will be able to read. You'll know what these numbers mean in a few more slides. So all of these boxes represent different elements that we know of. we're going to be really concerned with only a few of them, and I'll go into that in a few slides. Mostly ones up near the top and the outside edges of the periodic table. The ones near the bottom, some of them are things that are unknown. They have these U's. They're things that we don't even know really exist. They're things that might not exist really naturally. They're things that physicists have smashed things together to make, and they may have not even lasted for a second. They may have lasted for a fraction of a second. So we're not going to really be concerned about these in the biological sense. It's mostly the ones up here. So we talk about elements for a little bit. So the periodic table of the elements. This is a graphic of them. It's got a bunch of information, and we're going to go over a little bit more detail on what the numbers mean in a second. But first off, what of all of these, and this is from your book and it only goes up to 54, or as you can see the one on the wall here goes up to 114. So obviously there's a lot of elements that we're not going to be concerned about as biologists. Only of these, this big chart has 114, only about 25 elements are essential to life of all the elements that exist out there. The majority of living matter, about 96%, is composed of only 4 elements: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. And really, these are the 4 elements that we're going to spend most of our time talking about. You're going to know the most about these 4 elements. You'll know off the top of your head what kind of bonds these elements can make, how many of different bonds these will make in a few more slides, probably even later today. The remaining 4% of living matter is mostly made up of a few other elements: phosphorus, sodium, magnesium, potassium, calcium. I don't expect you to memorize these. Knowing these 4, that's pretty important. They're things we're going to talk about a lot. Knowing the rest of these, don't worry too much about. You can always look that up if you need to. The rest of the 25 elements are what are known as trace elements. And trace elements don't mean that they exist in Earth as a small amount. What it means is that they're required by organisms in small amounts. So there's trace elements are things that we don't need much of, but if we don't have them, then we can't function properly. So there's a lot of kind of vitamins. There's a lot of like small, very essential things. Things that, because we live in a pretty industrialized, wealthy society, we sneak them into our diet. So salt is iodinized salt. You probably have seen that on your salt packets. Iodine is a trace element. It's something that we need. It's essential, but we only need small amounts of it. And for some reason, lots of people don't get it in their diet. They don't eat the right, a diverse enough diet to get it. Maybe they're spending all their time just eating Big Macs. So we sneak it into their diet by putting it into salt, and so you get iodine and you're fine. There's lots of things like this. Lots of vitamins end up being trace elements, and this is why we take multivitamins. So you don't have to eat fruits and vegetables. So you can just take a pill and you're good to go. So things that, you don't need them in large amounts, but without them, bad things happen to you. Okay. So we're going to be learning a lot about carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, and a little bit about some of these other elements as well. Elements, if you break them down into the smallest thing that still has the property of that element, you've got something called an atom. So we're going to start off talking about the smallest thing we can possibly talk about in terms of elements, which is a single atom of an element. An atom is the smallest unit of matter containing the properties of an element. So each of these, we can talk about an atom of hydrogen, an atom of helium, atom of carbon, atom of oxygen. And that's what we're going to start off doing. Atoms are composed of 3 main components. So if you talk to a physicist or a chemist, they'll tell you about other things that are involved in atoms. But for biologists, basically atoms have 3 parts to them. They have parts of them that are positively charged, that are called protons. They have parts that are negatively charged, which you can't see here, that are called electrons. And they have parts that are neutrally charged, which are conveniently called neutrons. So there are protons, neutrons, and electrons. That's what makes up an atom. Okay. So, what does an atom look like? Well, the positively charged and the neutrally charged parts, the protons and the neutrons, hang out in the center of an atom, the region we call the nucleus of the atom. The electrons hang out around the outside. And chemists will be very specific in how they hang out around throughout the outside. I'm going to draw them in as much detail as I want you to know them. We're just going to actually put rings around the nucleus and put some dots on it, and that's how we'll draw them for this class. If you take a chemistry class, you'll learn about things called the S and the P and the D and all these kinds of orbitals, and they've each got different shapes to them and different properties like that. So we're not going to get that detailed. So electrons on the outside, protons and neutrons in the center. Okay, so if we look at let me see how this works when I put this down. Draw a little bit. Okay, so if we look at the periodic table, it has a bunch of these little boxes. And these boxes have some words on them, some letters, and some numbers. So here is the box for helium. So up here, helium. And it's drawn in different ways. You can see this one out of your textbook has the word written out nicely, so you can see what it is. The one here does not. But there's always a number above the letters, and there's a number below the letters. These numbers will help you figure out how many protons, how many neutrons, and how many electrons an atom of an element has. Okay? And that's one thing that you should be able to do by the end of this class. Okay. So this number up here, number 2, is something called the atomic number. And this is the number of protons in an atom of an element. So helium with an atomic number of 2 has 2 protons. How many protons does oxygen have? 8. Pretty straightforward, right? And carbon? 6. Okay. That's probably the easiest thing to do, right? You just look at the number above it. That's the number of protons. So that's the number of positively charged parts. Okay. So 2 protons for helium. Okay. Here's the next little trick. The next thing we're going to figure out is the number of electrons. If the atom is neutrally charged, the number of protons, or positively charged parts, is going to equal the number of electrons, or negatively charged parts. That should hopefully make sense. If you have 2 positives and 2 negatives, they cancel each other out and you're neutral. So helium, as long as I either tell you it's neutral or I don't tell you that it has a charge on it, it's going to have 2 electrons. Right? So 2 electrons here. 2 protons, 2 electrons. If helium had 3 electrons, we're just thinking ahead a little bit, what would be its charge? All right, it'd be -1. If it only had 1 electron, what would be the charge on it? It would be +1. Okay, and we're going to get to those cases. There are cases where an element or an atom of an element has a different number of protons and electrons. But to start off, we're just going to assume they all have the same number of protons and electrons. And just so I've mentioned this, if I was to change this atom and take away a proton, it would no longer be helium. They're named based on their number of protons, and so that's why they're put in order of the atomic number, the number of protons. They're all named based on the number of protons, not based on the number of electrons. Electrons will vary, and it's still the same element. Okay, so we figured out 2 out of the 3 parts. The third thing we want to find out is the number of neutrons, and this requires this second number. So the number here, 4.0026, is something we call the atomic weight or the atomic mass. The atomic weight equals really the number of protons plus neutrons plus electrons. However, protons and neutrons have a mass or weight of 1 Dalton each, And electrons have a mass of 0.0005 Daltons each. Dalton is the unit that we measure atomic weight in, and that's the unit all these numbers are in. So if I'm looking at the atomic weight, what do you think it tells me? Okay, it tells me about the neutrons and the protons because they are about 1 Dalton each. We can pretty much ignore the mass of the electrons, especially the elements that we're looking at are so small, have so few electrons, that that doesn't even add up to 1. It won't make up a significant portion of the mass. I mean, you have 4 electrons, and you still only have 0.002 Daltons. It's not much to make a difference. So we can really think of the atomic weight as the number of protons plus neutrons, and simply the number of protons plus the number of neutrons, right? So if the atomic weight equals the number of protons plus the number of neutrons here, how many neutrons does helium have? Okay, so we have 2 protons, atomic weight of about 4, we can round it off to its highest mass, so or nearest whole number. 2 plus number of neutrons equals 4. Do a little bit of very simple math, and you know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So this has 2 neutrons. So you'd be right, 2 neutrons there. Okay, so let's quiz you on this using your clickers. How many neutrons does fluorine have? So what is the atomic number? That's the number of protons plus neutrons. 18.9984 minus 9 would give you 9.9984, pretty close to 10. So you would round this off to 10. Right? So don't ignore what's after the decimal point, because this is pretty much 1. Right? So round it off to the whole number, then subtract the number of protons, and that would give you it. So the best answer here would be 10. I know it's 9.9984, but that's really 10. Yep.
So you take the 18.99, which is around
Yep.
19, and you
Subtract that. Yep.
you minus the atomic number,
Yep.
and then that's how you get the amount of neutrons.
Yes. Yes. So this is the number of protons plus neutrons. That's the number of protons. So atomic mass minus atomic number gives you the number of neutrons, and you would round the atomic mass off.
And so you how to get the amount of electrons.
It equals the number of protons
So you know,
for now. Yep. Yep, it would be 9. Yep. So fluorine would have 9 protons, 9 electrons, and 10 neutrons. Right. Okay. Okay, so let me just do another one real quick. So lithium, Li. Lithium, so protons, neutrons, electrons. So you can see it over here, lithium. How many protons would lithium have? It would have 3, that's pretty easy. Right? How many electrons would it have? It would also have 3. And how many neutrons? Okay, so 6.941 is pretty close to 7. Subtract 3 gives you 4. How about hydrogen? I'm picking all kinds of tricky ones, but so hydrogen has how many protons?
1.
That's 1. How many electrons then? 1. And how many neutrons?
0.
Yeah, it does have 0. Hydrogen's going to eventually, we'll see it lose its electron occasionally, in which case it'll only be a proton. And I'll actually probably refer to it as a proton occasionally when I'm not thinking about it. So you'll see that. There are some that have an equal number of everything. So like nitrogen here has 7 protons, 7 electrons, and how many neutrons? 7. So it's 7, 7, 7. So there are a lot of them that have the same number of everything. But good so far with this? This makes sense? Okay. All right. There are things called isotopes. So what an isotope is atoms of the same element that have different numbers of neutrons. So carbon has several isotopes. Carbon, 99% of carbon atoms are what are called C12, carbon 12. They have 6 protons, 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons here. But there are also some carbon, a very small percentage of it, that are C13 or C14. So they have 7 neutrons or 8 neutrons. So their mass changes based on the number of neutrons. And if you've heard of carbon-14 dating before, you may have heard that word occasionally. It's a way of telling how old something that is dead is, basically. Most isotopes are not stable. So there's usually a very common isotope, there's a common form of it, and then there are some non-common forms of it. And a lot of times the non-common form is not very stable. And so it gets converted into another form. Either it will lose neutrons, or some of them will actually lose protons, and they'll change what element they are over time. So what happens is carbon-14, they call it decay. It will decay over time. So in a living organism, we have a certain ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in living tissue. When living things die, the carbon-14 starts to degrade and go away. And so you see a different ratio form. And by looking at the ratio between these two isotopes in a fossil, you can tell how long that fossil has been dead. So I'm not going to go into any of the details of that because that would be a whole lecture on its own. But it's kind of a cool thing you can do. But that's what an isotope is. Isotope is atoms of the same element that have different numbers of neutrons, and so they have a different atomic mass. Okay, so now that we know how to look at the periodic table and figure out the parts of an atom, we're going to talk about how to draw them briefly. So, in the biological world, electrons are arranged in shells, or rings around the nucleus. And at least for today, probably after today I'll stop drawing them this way anyway because it's tedious in itself. We basically ignore what's in the nucleus. We ignore the number of protons and the number of neutrons because, as you'll see later on, they don't play as big a role in how these atoms interact with each other as the number of electrons do and where the electrons are found. So I'm going to really talk about where the electrons are found, and that will be kind of the major take-home message from this first little part. The electrons are arranged in shells. The first electron shell can hold up to 2 electrons. The next few shells can hold up to 8 electrons. We're not going to worry about anything that has any different kind of arrangement. We're actually not going to talk about any of these metals, any of the things in the center that actually have a shell that gets backfilled, and there's all kinds of complex things that if you took a really good chemistry class you probably learned about. We're not going to worry about that. We're going to talk about just really simple atoms and how to draw them. So here's some pictures. I don't particularly like the way they've done this for now. It'll help you later on. The electrons are the purple dots here, and the kind of white dots are vacancies. So it's showing you how many electrons could be in that shell versus how many are in that shell. And this is going to be important later, but it might be confusing right at this moment. So hydrogen, which has an atomic number of 1, has 1 single electron. So if you're going to draw hydrogen, you have a shell with 1 dot on it. Right? Carbon has 6 electrons, so it's going to have 2 dots on the first shell. The first shell can only hold 2. The other 4 are going to go on the second shell. Nitrogen has 7, so it's going to have 5 on that outer shell. Oxygen has 8, so it's going to have 6 on the outer shell. Phosphorus has 15, so it's going to have 2, and then 8, and then 5. So it has 2 and 8, which is 10. And then it's got 5 on its outer shell. Okay, what if I was to draw lithium? I'd have, how many electron shells am I going to have with lithium? 2 total. There's going to be 2 dots on the first shell, and how many would be on the second shell? 1. Okay. It's ultimately not terribly complex, as long as you remember 2, 8, and 8. For the purposes of this lecture and for this class, it doesn't matter how you, if you're going to draw these things, it wouldn't matter at all how you draw them, as long as you put the right number of dots on the right shell, because that's going to determine how these things bond. And it's actually going to be these white dots that we care about later on. So we'll get to that in a slide or two. So let me try something else that's not up here. What if I was to draw sodium, so Na? How many electrons does sodium have? All right, it has 11 electrons. So it would have, protons would be 11, neutrons would be 12, yeah, and electrons would be 11. If I was to draw sodium, I'd have 2 dots here. What would be on my second shell? 8 dots. And do I have a third shell? Yeah. And how many electrons are on that? 1. Okay, perfect. Okay, so, oh, you know, I've just given you some of these. I forgot this slide was here. Okay, just do this quickly. I know I've done 1 and 4, so do number 2 and number 3 at least, and just practice drawing them briefly, and I'll walk around and see how you're doing. Okay, so nitrogen has 7 electrons. That's good. So nitrogen has 7 electrons, so it would have 2 on the inner shell, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 somehow on that shell. Hopefully you all got that. You put 5 dots on it. Neon, see instead this was neon. How many electrons would be on that second shell? There would be 8, because there's 10 total. So it'd be like that. Okay. So why do we care about this? This is the... You have an answer? All right. That was kind of rhetorical, but why do we care? Yeah, okay. It matters how they bond. This makes a difference in how things bond. So there's someone that's done the homework or really paid attention in their last biology class. Good job. So electrons determine bonding. And the electrons that determine how an atom bonds are the electrons on the outermost electron shell. So we have a name for the outermost electron shell. We call it the valence shell, and we call those electrons the valence electrons. So atoms are most stable when their outermost or valence shell is full of electrons. Atoms with incomplete valence shells will react with other atoms with incomplete valence shells to make themselves more stable. So if we look at neon here, just briefly, neon has a full valence shell, right? Argon, full valence shell. Helium, full valence shell. All of these things in this column have full valence shells. They're what are called noble gases. Gases, noble gases, are non-reactive. They're not going to react. They're not going to interact with other atoms to form compounds because they're pretty stable on their own. These other things that we've been drawing all have incomplete valence shells. Hydrogen here has 1 electron. It could have up to 2. Lithium has 1 electron, could have up to 8. Sodium has 1 electron, could have up to 8. Carbon had 4 valence electrons. It could have up to 8. How many electrons are on the outermost shell of oxygen? Can you figure that out? All right, there's 2 on the innermost and 6 on the second one. That one can hold up to 8. So how many vacancies are there on oxygen's valence shell? 2. Okay, so it needs 2 more to be stable. Okay, so knowing the number of vacancies on the outermost or valence shell is going to tell us how an atom is going to bond with other things. Okay, there's another slide here. But another thing that tells us how atoms are going to bond is something called electronegativity. And this is a very confusing topic, so we're only going to just briefly touch on this. There's a chart from your book, and this is a chart from your book that tells you right out electronegativity. It's a factor of how many protons are in the nucleus of an atom, how many and how big the atom is. So the bigger the atom, the further away from the nucleus the electrons are, which means the less pull the atom has on electrons. The more protons, more positively charged bits are in the center of an atom, the more pull it has on the electrons. So you'll see every time you go down a row, you're adding an extra electron shell, and the electronegativity numbers drop. So it gets less and electronegative as you go down the periodic table. The more you go to the right on the table, the more protons an atom has, and so the higher the electronegativity is. So fluorine here, and oxygen, and chlorine, they have pretty high electronegativities. They're on the top right corner of the periodic table. We're ignoring the ones with full valence shells. Over here, sodium, lithium, potassium here, they all have very low electronegativities. So electronegativity equals the ability to attract electrons. So let's say we're looking at sodium and chlorine here. This is the first thing we're going to look at. Sodium has very low electronegativity, and chlorine has a very high electronegativity, which means chlorine has a very high attraction to electrons, and sodium has a pretty low attraction to electrons, especially electrons on the outermost part of the atom. So here's sodium. Let me draw chlorine over here, just briefly, so we have it. So that's chlorine. So sodium has a very weak pull on electrons, especially its outermost electrons. Chlorine has a pretty high pull on electrons. When you have electronegativity is drastically different from one atom to another, one atom will take away electrons from the other. Which atom do you think is going to take the electrons? Yeah, so chlorine has a high electronegativity. It's going to strip electrons off of sodium. If it strips an electron off of sodium, what happens to chlorine's valence shell? It becomes full. So it's pulled off one of those electrons. It now has 8 electrons. Sodium has lost an electron. So look at its new outermost shell. How many electrons are on it? 8, and it's full. So now sodium's stable, chlorine is stable. But we've now changed their charge. This atom has gained an electron. It had initially 17 protons, and it had 17 electrons. It now has 18 electrons. So what happened to its charge? Remember, these are negative, these are positive. It now has a charge of -1. So chlorine is negatively charged. Sodium had 11 and 11. It now has 11 and 10. It's now +1. Okay, so atom that has gained an electron becomes negatively charged. We call this anion, or a negative ion. An atom that has lost an electron becomes positively charged, or a cation. And the silly way to remember this, cats have paws, so cations are positive. It's kind of corny, but it might help, right? So I now have a negative ion here. So an ion is something that has a different number of electrons and protons. Remember, I said we were going to come back to that. We now have a negative ion, and we have a positive ion. negative and positive charges will attract, the traction between anions and cations is something we call an ionic bond. Okay, so an ionic bond is an attraction between two ions. Okay so far? So this is the first type of bond. We're going to talk about 3 different types of bonds. This is the very first type of bond, where one atom has stripped an electron, could strip up to 3 electrons, some of them, from another atom, and you now have a positive and a negative atom, positive and negative ion, and they attract to each other. It's an ionic bond. So here's a graphic from your book on this. Sodium and chlorine. Sodium donates an electron to chlorine. You get a sodium ion, which is positive. You get a chloride ion that's negative. And you get a bunch of those together. You form a matrix or a crystal. And that's what table salt is. Table salt is a matrix of ionic compounds. Okay, so we don't have that much time left. So let's just do this first one here, lithium fluoride. So draw lithium and draw fluorine and figure out what happens. Which one donates, which one receives electrons, how many electrons, and what their charge might be. See this, we've got Li. So you've got 3 electrons there. Fluorine has 2 and then 7, right? So which one's going to lose an electron, which one's going to gain an electron? All right, lithium will donate 1 to fluorine. That should make sense, right? So what's lithium's charge going to be? It loses an electron, loses a negative electron, so it's going to be +1, and fluorine's gaining an electron, it's going to be -1. So this is your cation, this is your anion, and they're going to have a bond between them. All right, so that's an ionic bond. Magnesium oxide, if you were to draw that, you'll actually see that magnesium has 2 valence electrons. Oxygen is missing 2 valence electrons. So magnesium will give up 2, and oxygen will take 2. So magnesium would actually become a +2 cation. Oxygen will become a -2 anion. Okay, so that's the first of the bonds, and I don't know. What we'll do is on, well, we don't have class on Monday, so Wednesday we're going to start looking at the other 2 bonds, and then we'll start talking about water. We'll probably get to that on Wednesday as well. Okay, so we'll leave it there, and we'll pick up from this spot next week.